Hello, everyone. You are listening to She Leads with Carly, and in this show, we talk to the absolute best, brightest, and yes, badass leaders. Together, let's build a DNA of what it takes to rise to the top and truly make an impact. I'm your host, Carly Malatsky. I am excited to welcome our guest today, Tamar Yehoshua. Tamar is a venture partner at IVP, where she shares her experience leading and scaling innovative products with the next generation of market leaders. She joined IVP from Snyk, where she led product design and research as the chief product officer. She led Snyk through 10x revenue growth, an IPO, and an acquisition by Salesforce. Prior to that, Tamar was a vice president at Google, holding product and engineering leadership roles on Google's most important products, including search, identity, and privacy. She currently serves on the boards of Snyk and Yext, and Tamar has a bachelor's in mathematics from the University of Pennsylvania and a master's in computer science from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Tamar, it is such a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you for joining.
Oh, thank you for having me. And it's so weird to sit and listen to you go through my background.
I always love seeing the expressions from my guests when I'm reading the intro. It's always great. But anyway, first off, set the scene. Where are you in the world? What are you up to?
I am in San Francisco doing this from my house while there is some construction in the background fixing a leak from all the rains we had earlier.
Okay. So Tamar, as you know, I love to start off with going back to your childhood, and even more so, who was a big influence in your life that you see kind of seep through who you are today?
I think that my father was a big influence, both when I was growing up and as an adult. He always was kind of with me and was very good at giving a lot of feedback to me along the way.
Okay. And I want to go back to you at around, graduating high school, choosing a college. You ended up studying at University of Pennsylvania in mathematics. At this point, by the way, did you have a good idea of, okay, this is my career post-college. This is what I want to go into. I love math and I want to kind of pursue this for a long, long time? Or how are you thinking of your career and then through college?
I had no idea what I wanted to do. I still have no idea what I want to do. Like all throughout my life, I haven't been one of these people who have had an aspiration and always built their career towards that. So I was very stressed about in high school about, well, what should I do? What college should I go to? I got into a couple different colleges, didn't get into my first choice, but I was like, yeah, okay. But I didn't know how to make a decision. And so every night at dinner, we would sit down at dinner and we would talk about the different places, my different options. And my father was getting so bored of the conversation. We were repeating the same conversation over and over and over again. And he finally said to me, he said, there are no right decisions. You make a decision right. And that has been something that has stuck with me my whole life, because he's like, you will get the education you will get will be how much you put into it. It's not about the school. It's about what you do, and it's about how you work and how you study. And that's true in so many things in life. So that influence and that attitude of you get out what you put in. And I also would talk to my kids a lot about that when they were thinking of colleges today. It's so hard to get into college. It's like, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter where you go. You are going to learn if you study hard.
Yeah, I love that. I love that decision-making quote. And I actually use that with me today a lot. So take me now through, you chose to study math, right? At University of Pennsylvania. How are you thinking of your career beyond that? Because at least in my experience at Stanford, you have a lot of people where freshman year, sophomore year, it seems like everyone knows what they're doing. Everyone's either going to consulting or banking, and they have their whole life panned out for them. Mm-hmm. How was it in your experience? And was there ever a stressful moment of saying, okay, where is my career taking off? Where is my next job?
So most people that you look at and you say they have it together, they know what they want to do, they don't. Everybody's confused. And especially in college at that age, nobody really wants to know. They're like, I think I want to do this. They're changing their major. So there's a perception that other people are in a better situation than you are, but nobody should be swayed by that. I really struggled with thinking about what I wanted to do. I was always good at math. I was the kind of person in fifth grade who was pulled out of the math class to like go sit in the corner and do the special math. And like, and I didn't like even realize it, but because when I was young, me and my best friend Patty we always like sit in the corner and do the next grade's math. And so it was something that like my whole life I was pushed in that direction. And again, my father, when I was in high school, um, he wasn't sure that I really was good in math. And he's like, I'm not going to believe you're good in math unless you can do well at this. This was always the next thing,
Ah,
algebra or geometry or calculus. So it was kind of like a challenge for me. I like challenges.
yeah.
And so when I got to college, I'm like, well, it's hard to be a math major. I've always been told I'm good at math. So I'll go be a math major. And it was not because I said, oh, this is what I want to do in my career. This is the job I want. Being a math major is going to get me that job. It wasn't like that at all. It's like, I like the subject. I'm studying it. It's challenging. It's interesting. I'll study it. And not until senior year was I like, what do I do with a math degree? It's like, what kind
Yeah.
of job can I have? So I thought about it, and like people were like, you could be a math teacher, or you could go into insurance. This was before the days of data science. I think if I was a
Okay.
math major today, I would likely have gone into data science, but there was no data science profession then. And I didn't like any of the options of what a math major could do. So I decided I would go to graduate school.
Okay, makes sense. And at that time, by the way, looking back now, for those who are at a similar stage of kind of that lost, should I go to graduate school? Should I try get a job in something that maybe I don't like? How do you think of that? What advice would you give for those people when they're navigating that stage, whether it's choosing passionate and choosing that, what I love versus maybe security or I need to do this because that's what people say I should do?
It's so another thing that my father would always say is that if you like 80% of your job, you're lucky. Nobody likes 100% of their job. So you can never find something that every single part of it is good. There's always administration work you don't want to do or something that's hard, but you have to enjoy. If you're not going to enjoy what you're doing, you're not going to work hard and you're not going to put the time into it. So you should never do something because other people say you should do it. I see some people in their careers, they have gaps. Like they have a gap of knowledge in some area and they say, I'm going to get my next job to fill in this gap. Well, that job usually doesn't work out. Because if it's a gap and
Yeah.
it's something you don't enjoy and you're not good at, then you're not going to be good at the job that's filling in that gap. So you should be building on your strengths and what you're good at and finding the jobs that build on those as opposed to the thing that you think you should do. Now, obviously, economics and what's your financial situation, all of that plays into it. Can you afford to go to graduate school? Can you not? So, those things, you have to balance all of these things, and that can be a very stressful and difficult balance. And I think you also have to believe in yourself because there are lots of jobs out there. When I started
Yeah.
looking for jobs, you don't even realize all the professions. When you're young, you hear about the most obvious professions, but there's so many, like even in tech, you can be writing code, but there's so many other things you could be doing that you don't even know about when you're in college. So you just have to talk to people. What are the different jobs out there? Just do a lot of investigating, a lot of reading to uncover what all the opportunities are.
So I want to push back even on you've been a product leader for most of your career, right? VP at Google, at Amazon, at obviously chief product officer at Slack. And I was taught often that being a product leader in tech companies requires a good sense of technical knowledge, or at least understanding to some degree. How do you think, obviously, you got your master's in computer science, you had that technical foundation, but looking back now, how important was having that foundation and maybe others who think that they need to fill in that gap with, technical experience to fulfill a product role? How do you think of that?
So I did start out as an engineer. So I was an engineer for many years, and then I was an engineering manager, and then I shifted into product management. So it really the when I look at product managers, there's a range of product managers. There are product managers who are on the technical side, and there's the on the analytical side, on the UI side, on the marketing side. So that to be a good product manager, there's a breadth of skills that you need, but there's also different types of product managers. Like if you're going to be a product manager at Databricks or an infrastructure company, you've got to be really technical. If you're going to be a product manager at AWS, you need to understand what developers need. If you're going to be a product manager at Figma, you need to understand design. So there are different jobs that require different things. And I definitely would encourage most product managers to have a product manager needs to at least understand what the job of a developer is. They need to at least have taken a class in coding, have built an app, a simple one, knows how to compile the product that they're working on, deploy it.
Right.
That doesn't mean you have to be an engineer for 2 years, but you absolutely have to have a respect for how difficult the job is, what is hard, what is easy. So if an engineer says it's going to take 2 weeks or it's going to take 2 months, you can know, are they padding? Are they not? So you have to understand the job. So that
Yeah.
I absolutely think is important. I don't think you can be a good product manager without understanding what it takes to get something built and done. But most product managers I know usually had some technical depth. But as I said, there's some positions that require less than others.
Yeah. Super interesting. And I love how you mentioned there are different ways to fill in that gap, right? It's not just, you don't have to go and get a job for 2 years and kind of be miserable during it and then, say you filled that gap. So I love that. So walk me a bit through your career at that early stage, post your master's at the Hebrew University. How are you thinking of your next step, right? What were you optimizing for at those stages to say, this is a company I'm excited to go work at?
I was optimizing for finding a job. At that point, I did my degree in Jerusalem and then moved back to the States. And those were the days where you sent a letter in the US mail for applying for a job with a cover letter. I must have sent like 50 letters out. And I wanted to get a programming job. As a programmer, you really don't learn to program in school. You learn on the job because, especially me,
Right.
I was like my master's was in logic reasoning. It was like not exactly a practical job or a practical master's, and I didn't really do a lot of coding. And it was not the economy was it wasn't at a time where it was like super easy to find a job. So for me, it really was like I want to find a programming job, and I wasn't optimizing for anything. And I found a job at a research institute, which was like, great, it's going to be interesting. And it was, and it defined, your first job defines a lot of what you do, kind of based on the people you work with, more than anything. But I was just
Yeah.
very happy when I got a job. I know that
Yeah.
sounds, it's really different than somebody who graduates in the heyday and everything is open to you.
Right. And I think a lot of people have recently experienced that with COVID, with the market fluctuating, all of that. So I think there's that piece of panic in a way, but also maintaining that composure to say, okay, this is a job that I'm excited about.
Yeah.
And so, how do you see a balance that needs to be kind of intentional, or how do you strike that balance?
Um, you have to appreciate the job that you have, and you have to make sure you're learning. And when you're young and you're first graduating, you're going to be learning no matter what job you take. You're learning
Yeah.
just how to get to the job at 9 o'clock in the morning and stay in one place for 8 hours. And like, it's just, you're learning to work. You're learning how to collaborate with other people. You're learning how to get a task done on time, how to work with a manager. So there's so much learning in your first job. And then you can do something else. It's not, some people feel like, okay, now I'm tracked and I can never change. I mean, I think it was like 2.5 years I don't actually remember how long I was. And then I moved out to Silicon Valley. And so like I've had many pivots in my career, even though I've been in tech my whole career, but things that have changed the trajectory of my career. So don't feel this weight that the first job or the second job is defining who you are going to be in 10 years.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. What was the moment in your career where you discovered product? And not only that, you realized I could actually excel in product and it seems like something exciting to me.
So I was at a startup, and in startups, you wear many hats. So I had always been an engineer and engineering manager. and never really had any interest in product. But I was at this startup, and that I was a VP of engineering, and the head of product left, and they're like, "Tamar, the product manager should report to you." I'm like, "Okay." So that was, it wasn't like this. I'm going to get there. I'm going to take these classes. It was not strategic at all. It was
Yeah.
a. It's kind of, if you're doing something well, and you get, so the head of product left, so they needed somebody, and if you're interested and you're engaging and you're trying to solve problems, then people come to you to help. And that was kind of what happened. And then I'm like, oh, this is kind of fun. This is kind of interesting. And that was like the trajectory change. And then the next job I took was much more of more of a product and engineering role.
And was this at this point, was this at Amazon, or at what point did you now take on these leadership purely focused in product, really?
It kind of went back and forth.
Okay.
So the startup, I started managing the product managers, and then when went to Amazon, um, I I actually joined as an IC, and as like the first person on a new product, but I joined as an engineering director. But then I started like building the team and hiring product managers and hiring engineers, and then it kind of morphed more into a GM role. So I think one of the things that characterizes what I've done is I've taken a lot of risks of when I'm like leading large teams, and then go to a small company leading no one, go back to a big company. And I
Yeah.
mean, everybody, it's cliche, says your careers are not a ladder. They're like a zigzag. And that's very true of my career, because you learn new things. When you go to a startup as an IC, you learn something very different. Like I was at Intel managing a team of about 50 people, and I left to a 10-person startup where I was an IC. I like to do things where
Yeah.
everyone thinks I'm crazy. So it was 1999, and everyone was like, "You've lost your mind. What are you doing?"
And so, in those moments, what really drives you besides the outside noise saying, Tamar, what are you doing? This is crazy. But what really got you going and excited about, you know what, this is time for a 10-person startup? Yes, it's risky, but this is what's exciting to me. What were those big pointers in your mind that you were like, I want to take this next step?
There were two things that happened at that point. I looked at my peers who had been at Intel for 10, 15 years, and uh, I said, "Is this where I want to be in 10 years? Is this like looking, if I say now, looking back, if I don't take these opportunities, this is what my career looks like." So it was kind of the opposite of saying, "Here's where I want to go." It was more like, "Here's where I don't want to go." So will I
Yeah.
be happy if in 10 years I'm still on this staff or one or two levels above and have been here for 10 years? And it was such a resounding no. Like that just didn't seem interesting to me. And then that, coupled with, it was 1999, the web was happening. Nobody had experience in the internet. Nobody was a Java programmer at that point. And I felt like if I go now, I can learn with everyone else. But if I wait in 3 or 4 years, everybody's going to have 3 or 4 years of experience in the web, and I'll be behind. And so those two realizations together said,
Yeah.
this is the time to take a risk. Now, I went to a startup that failed, so it wasn't like I picked the right one. But
Right.
it's actually, it might still be around today, but like it didn't take off. It's like did the whole hiring a bunch of people, firing a bunch of people, like, all
Yep.
of that.
Seen
But
it many times. Yeah.
the learning was amazing, and you can't take the learning away from somebody. So what I always give advice to people is, no matter what age or what level of experience, if they're considering going to a startup, assume it's going to fail. And if it fails, will you have felt like you made the right decision because you've learned? And so for my case, it changed the entire trajectory of my career because I moved into the internet early. And then
Wow.
I went from, one startup to another startup to Amazon to Google. Like that never would have happened if I didn't leave Intel in 1999.
And I remember I went to a fireside chat with you not too long ago. And one thing you definitely mentioned is the importance of people. At anywhere you work, it's just following the people, being around people who you look up to and aspire to be. So I want to go a bit deeper on that and say, how can you accurately and confidently evaluate people before actually, being there full time, working with them day in, day out, more in that interview stage, if you will? How do you evaluate them and how did you, throughout your career?
Uh, it's very hard because you have to have a gut instinct and you have to trust your instinct. And some people go against their instinct, and there are always flags. There's always signs, and they're little. And you have to listen to them and you have to say, okay, even though the job pays great, it's really wonderful. I saw this sign like the person snapped at the waitress when they didn't give them the right food at lunch. Like you see
Right.
these things, and then you always look back and you're like, I saw that and I discounted it. So, being aware of all these things, no matter how small they are, they matter. And the other thing is back channel. It is very hard to get a read on a person just from an interview, but we're all connected. We're connected on LinkedIn. Reach out to as many people as you know. Before I joined Slack, I did my homework on Stuart Butterfield. Like I talked to people who had worked with him before. I knew what I was getting myself into. I knew his strengths and weaknesses. So especially the more senior the job, pay attention and
Yeah.
know what you're getting into. And I'll tell a fun story that I like when I it's the first time. So Stuart Butterfield is founder and CEO of Slack. So when I decided to go to Slack, a lot of it was to work with Stuart. And the first time I had coffee with him, first time I'd ever met him, I was a little bit early because I was nervous. I was meeting Stuart Butterfield, who's also the founder of Flickr. So I got
Yeah.
there early and I got my coffee and I was sitting down and he gets there and he said, I'm going to go back and order my coffee. And he comes back with 2 glasses of water. I'm like, oh, Stuart, I didn't like, how did you know I wanted a glass of water? And he's like, well, when you drink coffee, you always want a glass of water. And it's like the smallest thing. But I was like, this
Yeah.
is a person who has empathy, who pays attention to people around him, and who cares about other people. And it proved very true in how he was as a leader.
Wow, I love that. And I love even the notion of one, trusting your gut. I think people lose sight of that. And then even taking those little cues, meeting them in person, how are they acting towards others? I think that's so important. So I love that. So before we even get to Slack, I want to touch briefly on, you obviously worked at Amazon, you worked closely with Bezos, who, as we know, is a huge figure in tech. What are some key lessons that you've learned from that experience that you take with you today, or as a leader, as CPO at Slack, and now obviously as an investor?
I was very lucky to be at Amazon when it was smaller and when Bezos was still doing reviews with the teams. And
Yeah.
so I did get to have like we would have like quarterly reviews with him, and he was very consistent with his principles. So when you went into a review, you knew what he was going to ask you. Like his values were very clear. Customer obsession, you had to have relevancy of what you were doing, and because he was so consistent, you knew what he was going to ask, you knew how to be prepared, and you could be more independent because you understood how he was going to interpret things. So for example, like he cared about, I was running sponsored link advertising on the Amazon detail pages, and he cared about relevancy, and I knew I was in trouble when he would have a printout and he would pull up the printout, and I'm like, oh no, there's an ad there that wasn't relevant. He's going to give us a hard time. And sure enough, but I knew that was what he cared about. So this consistency of message was really, really important. And the transparency. And I think that I definitely carried with me. The other that he would constantly talk about was be customer obsessed and competitor aware. Don't
Mm.
be competitors obsessed. You want to follow what your customers need, not what your competitors are doing. And that was another
Yeah.
thing I took with me to every job.
And even more so, as a manager, how important is that transparency piece of making sure in the decision making process that you're transparent with, this is why we're making this decision, or how important does that come into play? And do you think managers often are scared to be transparent or they lose sight of it?
I think that's a really good point. Sometimes people are scared because they don't know how other people will react. It's very hard to be transparent because then you open yourself up to criticism, but it is
Yeah.
the what breeds trust. Because if you make a decision, you made a decision because of certain reasons. So tell people what those reasons were, and then they can also say, make suggestions, can say, you know what, you got that wrong. Maybe you should think about it this way, and sometimes you'll change your mind based on the
Mhm.
feedback that you get when you spell out your decision making process. But it is really the only thing, in my opinion, that breeds trust is by
Wow.
being transparent. Now, obviously, there are things that you can't, like you can't be transparent when you're performance managing someone. That's really hard. Sometimes people are like, why is this person still here? Like, I know they're on a product improvement plan, but I can't tell you that right now. So there's certain things that you just can't be transparent about. But when you can, especially product decisions, organizational decisions, people are people understand a lot more than you give them credit for. And if you explain it, and it's also, you can say, you know what, it's okay if you don't agree with me. You don't have to agree with me, but this is the decision and this is why.
Yeah. And even more so, I actually heard you speaking on another podcast about how to deliver feedback well. And it's very easy for managers to kind of get lost in the weeds and deliver a whole message with the feedbacks, secretly in there. But what do you think that is the most effective way to deliver feedback? And even more so, what cadence? Because in my opinion, what I've seen is at the end of the year is not enough in a way. It's hard for me to say, what I did in February, is only getting delivered in December. So how do you think of that?
Every Most employees always say they're not getting enough feedback, and because it's hard to give feedback. First of all, it's hard to understand what feedback to give. Sometimes you have a first line manager who's been managing for a year and they don't see it and they don't know it. Well, they need to be trained. So we need to give more support to our managers on how to give feedback and to identify what are people's strengths and weaknesses. So I think that's just a general problem in the industry of better training for
Yeah.
managers. But to answer your question more specifically, it's very important to give clear and concise feedback with examples and not to talk too much around it. Don't like talk for
Yeah.
an hour. Be like super clear. Carly, in this podcast, you did a really good job on A, B, and C. But when you asked this question, it didn't land well and you should change it. And that's like the clear and concise feedback. And don't, as I said,
Yeah.
don't talk too long. Make it crisp and make it an example. And if possible, and here's what you could have done that would have made it better. Do it right after you listen to the podcast. Like make the feedback immediate and clear. Because if, to your point, if you wait a month, nobody's going to remember it. So there are two ways to do it. Either you do it right after, or you do it right before when it's going to be useful. So like
Mhm.
before somebody's going to give a presentation, you really should do it in this way. And giving people love visuals and analogies. So I was doing a presentation and I had a coach who was helping me with I can't even remember what presentation it was. I was on a stage somewhere. And the coach afterwards says to me, "You're like going back and forth on the stage so much you look like a cage lion." I was like, I've never forgotten that. And so every time I'm on
Yeah.
stage, I'm like, don't look like a cage lion. So it was just so useful and so specific and so clear and concise. And I think all feedback can be that useful, clear, and concise. And don't be afraid to be direct. You know what? Some people
Yep.
don't like it and they're not going to like the feedback. And maybe it's not going to work out for you as a manager and them as the employee. And that's also okay. I think people shy away from either feedback, transparency in organizations because some people won't like their decision making. And the thing I tell people is like, if somebody's not right for your team or your company, it's okay if they leave. You want people
Yeah.
who are aligned with you, with your values and how you want to operate. And that's okay.
Super interesting. So, Tamar, from the outside, right? Me talking to you, you exude this confidence. And I want to know, taking your experience at Google and then to Slack, you started off as a director at Google and then worked your way up to a VP, in one of the most really important topics, like I mentioned in the intro, in search and identity and privacy, and then becoming the chief product officer at Slack. I want to know during those moments where you're almost, rising up the ladder, if you will, did you have a sense of imposter syndrome? Did you have a sense of, oh shit, can I do this? Or how did you navigate it internally and make sure that you're presenting the best version of yourself?
When I was debating whether to take the job at Slack, and I was leaving, I was, leaving a great job at Google. One of my daughter's friends, she was in a job that she hated. And I had been trying to convince her that she should get another job because she was so unhappy. And she's like, so I told her I was thinking about becoming the CPO at Slack. And she looks at me and she said, but aren't you scared? And I said, I'm terrified. Of course I'm terrified, but that's not a reason not to do it. Like
Yeah.
if you're not pushing yourself outside your comfort zone, you're not growing and you're not learning. Now, there's some people who their goal is to get into a comfort zone and that's what they want. And that's wonderful. And they know themselves and that's great. And I know a lot of people about like that who are really happy. So you have to know yourself of what you want. But I was somebody who liked to always be pushing myself. And
Hmm.
so by that definition, you're always going to be in situations where you're pushing yourself beyond what you're sure you can do. But you have to be careful to not push yourself into a situation where you will fail because there are situations you can get in over your head and you really don't have the skills to do it. And so you have to know what that balance is and you have to be willing to work really hard. So every time I've gone into these jobs, I work really hard. These, like, you look at people, anybody who's in these top jobs in any company, in any profession, they work really hard. So imposter syndrome is a very real thing for everyone. Like, I would talk to some of the VPs at Google that had been there forever. And this one guy was like, yeah, I don't know how I got hired here. I'm like, what do you mean? You're like running this 5,000 person org. He's like, yeah. And so it's everybody has it. It just can't stop you from doing what you want to do.
And oftentimes, I love that you mentioned that, by the way. And oftentimes, in the early stages of a new title or a job, you have that really uncomfortable setting, right? Where everything's new, you're learning a lot, you're learning all these different things. How long do you give yourself, in a way, to make sure that it's just a discomfort because it's new or because it's a new title versus the discomfort of saying, you know what, maybe this isn't for me, or maybe I do need to reconsider and maybe I'm hurting myself? How do you think through that?
You have to be aware of the signals that people are sending you, and you can
Okay.
tell if it's not working. And so it's the
Okay.
kind of thing, close your eyes at night in bed and say, are people around me happy with what I'm doing? Don't, like, I've had people the first week in the job come in and be like, am I doing a good job? I'm like, I don't know, you just got here. So I don't like be over eager of soliciting feedback, but you can solicit
Yeah.
feedback in ways that you can tell. And I would also say that as I got more senior, as I was in the workforce longer, in the beginning, my first probably 10 years working, I was terrified all the time. Can I do this job or not? So it gets easier because you get more people giving you more positive feedback along the way if you're in a good trajectory. So if you're in a place and you're not getting any signals from anyone that you think are genuine, then it's probably a bad thing. Or it might be,
Okay.
I had one job I joined within the first couple of weeks. I'm like, this was a mistake. And I was like, okay, now what do I do? I couldn't quit because I couldn't financially afford to just quit. And I'm like, I'm going to stick it out, but I'm going to make sure that the next job is a good one.
Wow. Yeah. And oh, it's so interesting. I can go in so many different directions. But Tamar, as the chief product officer at Slack, when you accepted that role, what do you think is your own secret to success or secret as a manager that other people actually don't do so much that maybe they should?
That's a really good question. I've been asked that question before and I always have trouble with it because the things that you do come naturally to you. So you don't see it
Right.
if they do or don't come naturally to others. But I think I listen very well. So I got to Slack. And by the way, when I joined Slack, I had never used the product.
Oh,
Here I was like leading the product, but because I had been at Google and we weren't allowed to use Slack. And so, I mean, I used it, I dabbled with it like a toy workspace. So that was super
right.
intimidating to be responsible for this product. So that was like a big learning curve for me. But I got there and I just listened. And what I've learned is to ask the right questions. And so I spent the first week, and by the end of the first week, I was surprised how quickly I was able to assess who was good, who wasn't, where the problems were, because everyone told me. They like came into
Wow.
my office and they told me all the broken things. And one of the people who reported to me at the end of the first week, he comes into my office. He's like, I hope we didn't scare you away now. And I'm like, no, because once you've been working in similar jobs for a while, they're the same issues. There's
Okay.
the same type of things that are broken. So you begin to pattern match very quickly. So I had been in enough leadership roles, leading product, getting it out, dealing with customers and PMs and engineers and the tensions between them, that I'd done that long enough that I could pattern match to hearing what the issues were to say, here are the biggest issues. And I also took advice from friends who had left Google, went to similar type size companies, talked to them. What did you do when you first got there? What are some of the pitfalls I should be aware of? So always be learning.
Yeah. People, it's so interesting because people lose sight of most things can be distilled into very simple action items. Like you said, the answers were at your fingertips as long as you listen and open your ears and accept it. So I think that's super valuable advice. And before we even go to the transition to now, investor at IVP, take me a little bit through your experience at Slack. You went through a whole bunch of different changes, and particularly when COVID hit, right? And not only, now everyone has to be on Slack, and it became this whole new form of communication that people really relied on. What did that look like internally for you as a CPO? How did you manage to get through that?
It was really energizing for the company because here was this pandemic that was going on, but we could help. We saw, if you looked at the graph of the people coming to Slack and new users signing up, it was the hockey stick. And we're
Yeah.
like, oh my God, all these people are coming to Slack because they're working remotely and they need a better communication tool. We need to be there for them. And so the whole company galvanized around this. And we started doing like onboarding sessions. Like everybody started signing up for onboarding sessions for new users. We completely rebuilt our onboarding. We changed some of the features that we were doing. So people felt good that they could do something, but then we also had the issue of burnout because some people, their kids weren't in school, so they were working less.
Right.
People who didn't have kids were working more, and like then and some people were sick, and so it was that balance of very energizing and burning out. So we had to be very careful. So we started doing things like one Friday a month off, no meeting weeks, and trying. We were experimenting. It was like this is the time to experiment with new ways of working. So we're going to be at the forefront. We started this thing called a consortium called the Future Forum, where we did research on knowledge workers, how they were handling the pandemic and the remote work. So we did things to try and help our customers. And then we were the guinea pigs in some way at Slack. We started experimenting with all these different ways of working. And the person at Slack from the Future Forum, the three people together, actually wrote a book called The Future of Work based on
Wow.
all of this. So it was a wild time to be at Slack.
Crazy. So moving forward a bit, take me through your thought process where you realize, you know what, I am ready for a change and I'm ready to, go away from that operating product role and now put on the investor hat. What was going through your mind and how's that experience been so far?
It's been a lot of fun. So I left Slack in February, and I was thinking about, I've been an operator and I've been leading teams for decades, and so I just wanted to do something different, and I wanted to learn some new skills. And part of it goes back to just being in touch with yourself. So I talked to recruiters, I talked about other jobs, and nothing was pulling me. Nothing was that
Okay.
exciting. And so I'm like, okay, there's a reason it's none. Then I have a number of VC friends, and I joined IVP and I've known them for 10 years. I was on the board with Jules Maltz from IVP, the board of Retail Me Not a very long time ago. We kept in touch. They also invested in Snyk. I'm on another board that was an IVP company. So I've just got a lot of tentacles with them. And over the years, I've met other partners from IVP. So I just started talking to people. I'm like, you know what? Let me try something completely different. And they were so warm and welcoming and
Wow.
made me feel that it was just kind of the right timing for them. And it was the right timing for me. So I joined in April as a venture partner and been enjoying the intellectual rigor of the job, which is trying to understand the landscape of what's going on, especially in AI. I'm leading an AI working group across the firm, and
Wow.
um, and just figuring out where the ecosystem is, meeting with all these amazing founders, meeting with portfolio companies, helping them scale their companies. So it's something that I feel like leverages the work that I've done, but is every day I'm learning.
And we talked about this briefly before, but one thing that is so different, right, from an investor to, CPO at Slack or working in tech at Google and Amazons of the world is the feedback loop is incredibly different. And as we all know, investing, sometimes it's a 10-year, 5-year loop where you realize, oh, that was a good investment or I did well there. How have you been able to manage that feedback loop? And yeah, how are you navigating through that?
There's no answer. It's super hard. When I was
Yeah.
thinking about doing the VC gig, I talked to a bunch of operators turned VC. And I would say it
Yeah.
was 50-50. Some of them hated it, some of them loved it, and everyone talked about the feedback loop. Everyone said that's the hardest part of the job, and it's absolutely the hardest part of the job. So I'm only like 7 or 8 weeks in, so I haven't done an investment yet. I've passed. I've been involved in deal teams where we decided not to invest, but I haven't actually
Right.
invested yet. And even you pass and you're like, did I make a mistake? Did I not? It's really hard, and I don't think there's any answer. And even the best investors that I've talked to, like great track records, are constantly questioning themselves. So you have to like the day to day of the job. You have to enjoy the working with founders, meeting with founders, doing the market maps, understanding the landscape, diving into the technology, learning about new domains all the time. So you have to
Yep.
enjoy it because you're never going to get the signals for a very long time.
Yeah. And you mentioned yourself how there's so much learning right now. You're learning every day, every minute, which is amazing.
Sometimes after some of the meetings, I'll like take one of the partners aside. I'm like, can you explain this slide to me? Like you're using all these terms I don't know. And then, so now I'm getting through like the basics.
Right.
But I've worked with VCs from the other side a lot, but it's very, very different. And IVP is super rigorous in how they do their due diligence. So it's actually really impressive to see the level of rigor that they go to, which I love.
I love it. I love it. And I feel the same way. Right now, I'm also investor hat at Floodgate. I find myself during these calls that I'm even sitting in, I am taking notes just for myself, right? What Mike and Anne and these partners are saying, I'm like, I am taking notes, grabbing it all in. It's amazing. I
So
love
are
it.
you enjoying it?
I am. I really love it. And I think it's a very much a testament to what we've talked about, even the people, right? Like I knew going in that I am going to learn so much because I am surrounded by incredible people. And so it's definitely lived up to that and exceeded that. So that's been great.
Wonderful.
So, Tamar, to finish off with some fun questions, I would love
Okay.
to know what is something that you're passionate about that's actually outside the orbit of, tech and work and everything?
Um, it's a hard question to answer because I spend so much time working. I haven't developed a lot of passions besides my kids. So for me, when my kids were growing up, it was all work and family. And
Hmm.
so anytime that I wasn't working, I would want to be with my kids. And it's where I wanted to be. It's like where you want to
Yeah.
spend your time. And I loved it. And I used to dance a lot, and my daughter dances. And so that's like kind of what we would do together. So having things that you enjoy. So I would dance with my daughter, I would play tennis with my son, and things that they enjoy, finding them and doing them with them gives me joy.
Yeah. And I have to ask one thing about obviously being a leader is that you're also a woman and a mom, and you decided to have kids, as you said. Was that something that was very tricky almost to navigate in terms of timing and thinking, okay, this is a good time because I don't want to compromise on my career? How do you think through that? What advice do you have for those who are kind of wrestling with that in their mind?
My advice is super
be a mom?
simple. Everybody
Yeah.
overthinks it because there is no good time. Like, it's really time consuming to have children. And there's not going to be a time in your life where you're like, I have so many hours free in my day, so now is a good time to have children. Like, you have to want to have kids. I had kids really early, and I didn't think about it at all. I didn't
Okay.
think about, can I afford it? Do I have enough time? I didn't anything. It's like, I knew I was going to have kids. And so I just kind of went with the flow and said, I'll figure it out. It's kind of like, you can tell that I do this with a lot of things. It's like, I'll figure it out. But I see some of these women who are like waiting for the perfect time. And, well, I have to have like this in line and this aligned. I'm like, just, if you want kids, it's going to be hard.
Just got to do it.
You're
Yeah.
not going to sleep for
No,
years.
I love it. And I mean, clearly from your incredible career, right? And then also having the mother hat, it's worked out. And I agree. I think I've heard that from a lot of guests on this show where it doesn't get easier. You become, VP and you think, oh, that's when I'll have kids. No, it just gets harder, it seems like. So anyway,
Yeah,
I love that. And
I had kids when I was in IC.
Okay. Yeah.
But there's no right answer.
And okay, Tamar, what is your superpower?
Whenever people ask me that, I feel like I don't have a superpower. But if I had to pick
I can name a few.
If I had to pick one, I would go back to asking questions and listening.
Yeah.
Yesterday, I was in an Uber, and the Uber driver starts asking me some questions about my name, where am I from, et cetera, et cetera. And then I just started asking him questions. And I was like, pulled on a thread that I thought was interesting. And then he tells me that he's like the CEO of a startup that's been in trouble. He had to lay everyone off. And he's like got this expertise in one area. I'm like, oh my God, I'm meeting a startup founder this afternoon in the exact same area that this guy was working in. And so he's like, oh, I'd love to talk to him. And he pulls out his card and he gives it to me. Then in the afternoon, I met with the startup founder. All I did was pull the card out. And he's like, where did you get that? I've been trying to find that company and figure out what happened to them.
Oh,
and then I'm like, well, the CEO was my Uber driver this morning. It was the wildest story. And
that's crazy.
That came from asking questions, listening, and pulling on threads.
Oh, I love that. That is a great story. And even from what I've learned being in venture capital, it seems like it's very natural to you because that's perfect. I absolutely love that. So Tamar, I have to thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've learned so much. So really, thank you.
Thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for listening to the show this week. If you enjoyed, please spread the word. Tell someone about She Leads or post about it on social media and tag us. If you want to contact us, feel free to send over a message through the She Leads Instagram page at sheleads.show. If you want to follow us on Twitter, our account is @SheLeadsShow, and mine is @Carly Malatsky. This episode was produced and edited by Nick Verschow. Thank you also to our partner, Floodgate. If you're passionate about startups and want to learn more about the starting journey of those who have built groundbreaking companies, I highly recommend listening to Starting Greatness with Mike Maples Jr., the founding partner of Floodgate. He has an incredible show that, in my opinion, is definitely worth your time. Thanks again.